Miss Suk Wang lost her mother when she was just a little girl.
It's hard on anybody not having a mom to rely on.
But when Miss Suk married, her mother-in-law filled the void.
She really looked to Linda as her mom.
Linda thought of Miss Suk as her daughter.
They were really close.
But then Linda mysteriously disappeared.
I had a bad feeling something happened to her.
It was unlike her not to answer her phone.
Miss Suk appeared as worried as anyone.
Miss Suk said that she had been trying to contact her all day as well. I could tell that my mom was hurting.
But would a stunning piece of evidence reveal a deadly betrayal?
You can see the shock and surprise on Linda's face.
Crest Hill, Illinois, September 5th, 2011. It was around 8 o'clock that Monday evening when Larry Tida phoned the police in this quiet bedroom community of 20,000, an hour southwest of Chicago.
It is very safe. I wouldn't think twice about raising a family here.
Usually. But Larry was calling that night to report that his wife Linda, a 70-year-old Chinese immigrant, was missing.
She worked as an interpreter for a number of businesses up in Chicago.
She also worked as an advocate, assisting new immigrants in almost any way she could.
She would help Asian immigrants in securing loans and getting English classes, starting businesses, and generally realizing their dream of America.
And according to her husband, she'd left home before dawn that morning to drive a new client into Chicago's Chinatown.
She would do this routinely for other Asian American immigrants.
She gave me a kiss on the cheek and said, "I'll see you in a little while."
She was supposed to be home back with Larry later that morning.
Linda was supposed to be back by 11 a.m., but as morning turned to afternoon and his wife hadn't returned, Larry began to worry.
About every hour on the hour, I was phone calling her and leaving messages to call me.
But she never returned any of his calls.
He said it was unlike her not to answer her phone, not to get in contact with him and let him know why she was running late.
And by 8 that night, with still no word from Linda, her husband had called the police.
I just couldn't take no more.
Larry's going out of his mind at this point in time.
Was he simply overreacting?
The vast majority of time a missing persons report comes back, the person's safe sound.
Or had something happened to the 70-year-old grandmother?
I had a bad feeling.
Linda's husband didn't appear to be alone in his fear either. In the days ahead, her son and her daughter-in-law, 45-year-old Miss Suk Wang, would all join in the frantic search for the missing grandmother. Although she'd married into a Chinese-American family, Miss Suk's story started in South Korea. Born in 1965, Miss Suk's mother died when she was just a baby.
It's hard on anybody that would have to go through that, not having a mom to rely on.
And with her father unable to take care of her, Miss Suk was sent to live with relatives.
They didn't treat her very nicely. In fact, treated her more as a servant.
Her upbringing wasn't the best. The black sheep is what she really basically felt like.
Luckily, Miss Suk's Cinderella story came complete with a Prince Charming, an American GI named Andy Nowlin, who met the 22-year-old in 1987 while serving in Korea.
She was a very kind person. She had a very good heart. That was, one of the reasons why I fell in love with her.
And in 1988, after Andy left the Army and returned home to Illinois, Miss Suk followed.
She was here a few months and then we got married.
Soon after, Miss Suk was pregnant, and in 1989, the couple had a daughter.
I stayed at home with my mom. Her main focus was to take care of me.
Money was tight for the young family, at least in Miss Suk's mind.
Money was always a key factor in their conversation. If somebody else has got this car, why don't we have that car?
And eventually, those conversations about money became arguments.
I was working 2 full-time jobs, working 80 hours a week, and it still wasn't enough.
And by 1998, after 10 years of marriage, the couple had divorced.
She was just so money hungry.
She wanted to give me the best of the best, to give the life that she did not have.
To support herself and her daughter after the divorce, Ms. Suk took a translating job at a local call center.
My mom was bilingual. She would talk to the Korean customers.
And soon after starting work at the call center, Ms. Suk met a man who appeared to offer everything the struggling young mother wanted for her family. The son of Chinese immigrants, Don Wang was working at the call center to put himself through college.
He was always going to school. Don was trying to get his PhD.
And despite the fact that Don was Chinese and Ms. Suk Korean, they started dating.
The two cultures don't always mingle, but in Don and Ms. Suk's case, they did.
Their marriage in 2003 was a celebration of both their cultures.
It was different mixes of Chinese and Korean people, and it was a great time. It was a beautiful wedding.
But when Ms. Suk said, "I do," she wasn't just marrying Don. She was joining his tight-knit family, led by its matriarch, Linda. Born in 1941, Linda had spent more than 20 years in the Chicago area. And by 2003, the 62-year-old was a prominent member of Chicago's Chinese community.
Linda was very well known in that community.
She'd spent years working as an interpreter for various businesses in the greater Chicago area.
She also worked as an interpreter with the federal government in the federal prison.
And she also worked with individual immigrants, helping them secure visas, housing, and jobs.
Assisting individuals that came into this country in any way that she could.
But as much as she enjoyed helping her fellow immigrants, Linda's priority was her only son, Don.
Don and his mother had a very, very, very close, relationship.
One that became even closer after Linda divorced Don's father.
They called each other 4 or 5 times every day, 7 days a week.
Don provided moral support for his mother after the divorce. In return, she helped support him while he pursued his PhD.
Don got a lot of his money from his mother.
And once he married Ms. Suk, Linda would gladly help support her, too.
Linda thought of Ms. Suk as her daughter.
Ms. Suk felt the same way, too.
Since my mom didn't have that mother figure growing up, she really looked to Linda as her mom. They were really close.
And at times, they seemed more like BFFs than mother and daughter.
They would go to Chicago and go to the spas together all the time. They would also go to Peoria on the riverboat. They would go to the casino.
In fact, thanks to her mother-in-law's generosity, Ms. Suk finally had the lifestyle that she had always wanted.
She drove a Mercedes-Benz. She always wanted the latest fashions, latest clothes, latest designers.
She was very attractive. She always made herself up. She always had makeup on and looked nice.
Linda even gave Ms. Suk the money to open her own sewing and alterations business.
My mom's always really good at, putting things together, sewing-wise, fixing my shirts for me growing up. So she decided to get a little shop in Bloomington, and she was really excited about it.
And in 2006, Ms. Suk repaid Linda's kindness with the gift her mother-in-law wanted most, a grandson.
There's no doubt that deepened the relationship between Ms. Suk and Linda.
And 4 years later, Ms. Suk's mother-in-law had her own happy news. At the age of 69, and after years on her own, Linda had found love.
We met on Match.com, and I met her at a restaurant, and everything sort of clicked real nice.
Linda and Larry Tida married in January of 2011.
Linda and Larry wanted to live out the rest of their lives with each other, the rest of their golden years with each other.
But it wasn't meant to be. On September 5th, 2011, just 8 months after their wedding, Linda mysteriously vanished. Coming up, just who was Linda taking to Chinatown?
I think it was a setup.
Was it possible she'd been abducted?
Might have been one of the Chinese gangs.
At around 8 p.m. on September 5, 2011, Larry Tida called the Crest Hill, Illinois Police Department and filed a missing persons report. His wife, Linda, a business consultant and interpreter who worked with the Chinese immigrant community, had left home before dawn that morning to pick up a client in Bloomington and drive them to Chicago.
Which wasn't unusual. She did this sort of things often.
She was going to be back by between 8 and 9 for us to have breakfast.
But the 70-year-old hadn't come home, and she hadn't returned any of her husband's increasingly worried calls either.
I started calling her on the hour, every hour, and I got no response, no answer, no phone call.
So at a little before 8, Larry had made another call to the police.
I had this bad feeling something had happened.
It was only a gut feeling, but it was enough to convince Larry.
She didn't contact anybody, and all of a sudden she's just gone. Nobody can get a hold of her.
So that's got to be very scary for the family.
Hoping to find a lead on Linda's whereabouts, the investigators pulled her phone records.
Our first thing is to look at phone records. This day and age, everybody's tied to their cell phones.
But when the investigators looked at Linda's phone records, they made a surprising discovery.
The last bounce off a cell phone tower from Linda's cell phone came from a tower here in Bloomington.
We literally can track from tower to tower all the way to Bloomington, Illinois.
So as far as we knew, that was the last place she was.
An hour and a half south of Crest Hill, Bloomington had been Linda's first stop that morning.
She had a client that she was supposed to come down here and pick up to take that client back to Chicago.
Had the meetup occurred, could it have something to do with Linda's disappearance?
This is not out of the realm of possibility.
However, when the investigators tried to track down the mysterious client, they quickly ran into trouble. Larry could only provide the sketchiest details.
She was a Chinese immigrant and needed a ride to Chinatown in Chicago.
And Linda's phone records were little help either, although there was one number on her log of incoming calls that the investigators found suspicious, one from a New York area code.
I had tried to contact it, and it always went to voicemail.
With the phone number a dead end, the missing persons investigators hit the streets.
The investigation at this phase goes into talking to everyone she knows in Bloomington.
Linda had friends here in the community that operated a number of the Chinese restaurants here in Bloomington. They went to several of the restaurants, but nobody had any contact with her. Nobody knew anything about where Linda had gone or who she might have met with.
They also tried to contact Linda's son, Don, and his wife, 45-year-old Miss-Suk Wang, who lived in Bloomington.
They made contact with Miss-Suk that evening.
Miss-Suk told the investigators that her husband was out of town on a trip to California. She also said that she hadn't heard anything from Linda all day, which was strange.
Miss-Suk said that she had been trying to contact her all day as well.
And when the investigators asked what she thought had happened to her mother-in-law, Miss-Suk raised a chilling possibility.
Miss-Suk made an indication that it might have been one of the Chinese gangs.
According to Miss-Suk, her mother-in-law's work with the federal prison system meant she'd occasionally translated for gang members.
She worked as an interpreter for Chinese nationals that were in custody.
Was it possible one of the inmates Linda worked with had criminal contacts on the outside? Contacts who might abduct the successful businesswoman.
I didn't know what was going on, that if somebody had her, that if it was for money or whatever.
And Larry's fear only deepened as 2 days passed with no word or sign of Linda.
You don't sleep too much when you don't know what's going on or what's happened.
Linda's husband Larry and her daughter-in-law Miss-Suk weren't the only ones that appeared to be worried sick over the 70-year-old's disappearance. There was also Linda's assistant in her interpreting and consulting business, a Chinese immigrant named Jenny.
I actually reached out to Jenny when I got the cell phone records to see if she had any other information that she could provide. She was kind of Linda's right hand.
Unfortunately, Linda's right hand told the investigators she had no idea what had become of her boss.
Jenny seemed generally concerned about what had happened to Linda and where she was.
Jenny was hardly alone either. In the days following her disappearance, Crest Hill's Chinese community and Bloomington's launched their own searches for the missing 70-year-old.
Linda was pretty well respected in the Chinese community.
The Chinese community was actively trying to pursue what could have happened to her.
In Bloomington, where Linda's phone records placed her last, police continued the search too.
I asked for patrol officers to go out and check the airport, parking lot, check hotels parking lot to see if we can find Linda Tida's vehicle.
And before long, the search expanded to the whole Chicago area, and then some.
Basically, the entire state had the information to try and find her.
But by September 6th, with Linda missing for more than 36 hours, even the police were starting to fear the worst.
My gut instinct is something bad's going on here. This isn't just a missing person.
But if it was a kidnapping, why hadn't anyone contacted the family for ransom? Don didn't know for sure, but he agreed with the investigators that the mysterious New York number that showed up in Linda's phone records might be the key to finding out who had set her up.
90% of the clients, they mostly from New York, their cell phone number start with 917, which is a New York number.
After Don's interview, the investigators tried the New York number again, and this time it didn't go to voicemail.
It was disconnected.
Was Don onto something? Was the New York number connected to his mother's disappearance? The investigators thought so.
I had the FBI try and look it up.
But before the FBI was able to track down the number, a stunning break would lead the search for Miss Suk Wang's mother-in-law in a surprising new direction. Coming up, the investigators recover a crucial piece of video.
You can see the shock and surprise on Linda's face.
But the real shock is who else gets caught on tape.
You can see Linda backing away from her.
By September 12, 2011, it had been a week since 70-year-old Linda Tida had disappeared in Bloomington, Illinois.
The last known ping from a cell tower is here in Bloomington, and that's when the investigation and search for Linda begins.
Linda's daughter-in-law, 45-year-old Miss Suk Wang, told investigators that she worried that her mother-in-law had been abducted or robbed. But on September 12th, a stunning new lead would turn the investigation into Linda Tida's disappearance in a shocking new direction. The break came from Bloomington's Chinese community.
And the close-knit Asian American community here in Bloomington becomes aware that Linda's missing. That leaks throughout the entire community.
And one of the people that heard the news was a waitress at a local Chinese restaurant. A waitress who had a strange story for the police.
She comes forward about a weird thing that she had done on another person's behalf.
According to the waitress, the weird thing had started when a well-dressed woman she'd never seen before approached her at work on September 4th, the day before Linda disappeared.
She went in there and asked the hostess specifically if they spoke Chinese.
And when the waitress said that she spoke Chinese, the mystery woman had asked her for a favor.
She asked her to make a phone call for her.
A phone call to Linda.
She told her to tell Linda that she needed a ride to Chicago. She would pay $500 for this ride. Linda accepted.
She'd actually been set up in a ruse of sorts.
And just who was this mystery woman who'd set Linda up? The waitress couldn't tell the police, but the restaurant's security cameras could.
The officers pulled the surveillance video, and you can clearly see Miss Suk going into the restaurant.
But if Linda had been set up by her daughter-in-law, What had she set her up for? All the waitress knew was that Miss Suk wanted Linda to meet her at a local Bloomington grocery store. And when the investigators pulled the security footage from that store, they made another stunning discovery.
Linda pulls into the parking lot, stops under one of the light poles, and further back in the parking lot, you see a pair of headlights come on, and you see the headlights drive around the parking lot and come in and pull in next to Linda's vehicle.
The car that pulled in next to Linda was Miss Suk's Mercedes.
Miss Suk had laid in wait for Linda.
On the video, both women got out of their cars, and Miss Suk started screaming at her mother-in-law.
You can see the shock and surprise on Linda's face.
You can see Linda backing away from her.
Linda was trying to leave, but Miss Suk would grab her by the arm, grab her by her purse, grab her by her shirt.
And then, just as it appeared the argument was on the verge of turning violent, it was suddenly over.
It ends with the two women going back into their respective vehicles and driving away.
What was the confrontation about? And did it have anything to do with Linda's disappearance? On the evening of September 12th, the investigators brought Miss Suk in for questioning.
As we're talking, I said, so when was it exactly the last time you saw her? And she says, well, I went to their house, and I want to say it was like September 1st.
Which was 4 days before the parking lot confrontation.
Why would she not be truthful about having a conversation with Linda Tida in the parking lot?
She wanted to play the play dumb routine. Like, I don't know anything about anything.
Miss Suk could deny it all she wanted, but the police had her on tape. In fact, that wasn't all they had. While Miss Suk was talking to the detectives, crime scene investigators were busy searching her home in Bloomington and her alteration shop, the business her mother-in-law had helped finance.
We have the search warrants. We want to make sure Miss Suk isn't around when we execute him.
And in the dumpster behind Miss Suk's shop, the detectives found something.
I found a lot of ID cards and credit cards that were cut up into small pieces.
But while the cards had all been cut up, the investigators were still able to read them.
I was still able to make out the name of our missing person, Linda Tida.
And that wasn't all they found either.
A shirt was found in the dumpster with some blood on it.
Crime scene investigators immediately conveyed that information back to the detectives questioning Miss Suk. And the result was a dramatic shift in Miss Suk's interrogation.
Now my job is to get Miss Suk to tell me what happened. And whether I believe that's what happened, it doesn't matter. I just need her to start talking about it.
And once the investigators confronted her with what they knew, the video, the cut-up IDs, and the blood, Miss Suk finally began to talk. According to Miss Suk, she would never do anything to hurt her mother-in-law.
Linda and Miss Suk's relationship was great in the beginning. Miss Suk thought of her as the mother she never had.
In fact, she told the investigators that she truly loved Linda.
She would even call her mom.
And Miss Suk said she'd done everything she could to make Mom happy.
In the Asian culture, you want to please your mom and your family, and it's really important.
However, according to Miss Suk, something had eventually come between them, her marriage to Linda's son, Don.
I could just see that their marriage wasn't the greatest. I could tell that my mom was hurting.
And Miss Suk said she was hurting because she suspected Don was cheating.
Miss Suk believed that her husband was having an affair.
And it wasn't just some casual hookup either. Miss Suk suspected that her husband was having an affair with Linda's assistant, Jenny.
It was devastating on my mom. She had no idea that this was going on at all. Jenny and my mom had known each other for a really long time.
And Miss Suk said that Linda's attitude about the alleged affair was just as devastating.
Miss Suk believed that she knew about it and was almost happy about it.
And the idea that her mother-in-law supported the alleged affair hurt Miss Suk deeply.
Miss Suk had been abandoned by both Don and Linda. I think this took a heavy, heavy toll on her.
But she also said that she was determined to fight.
My mom didn't want to give up on their marriage. She didn't want to have another divorce.
And Miss Suk said she had arranged the parking lot meeting as a last-ditch attempt to enlist her mother-in-law's support.
She was actually trying to possibly talk to Linda and trying to get her to see her point of view. I need you to help me get my husband back.
But Miss Suk said that the meeting had quickly turned angry.
Miss Suk, she had a temper. Linda had a temper as well.
She didn't want to talk to my mom. She didn't want to have anything to do with her.
But if the argument had ended with Miss Suk and her mother-in-law each driving away, how did Linda's ID and credit cards end up in the dumpster outside the sewing shop?
Linda chose to follow Miss Suk back to the sewing shop.
Miss Suk told the police that once they arrived at the shop, a second angry confrontation occurred on the sidewalk outside. And according to Miss Suk, her mother-in-law had turned violent.
Linda started it.
Just started hitting my mom and just started hitting her in the temple and the head.
Miss Suk told the police that she and Linda had soon tumbled to the pavement.
Miss Suk said Linda was on her back, reached up, choking Miss Suk.
And Miss Suk, desperately trying to break free, had done what she could to fight back.
Miss Suk was on top of her, choking Linda.
My mom at that point just felt like this lady is trying to kill me.
But Miss Suk said that in their struggle to the death, her 70-year-old mother-in-law had succumbed first.
The next thing she knows, she was dead.
Miss Suk said she'd tried to save Linda, a claim she repeated later that night when the investigators took her to the sewing shop and asked her to walk through what happened.
I tried to mask them out.
You tried to mask them out?
It's just no way goes.
And once she realized that her mother-in-law truly was dead, Miss Suk said she'd hidden the body in the sewing shop overnight.
She puts her behind some clothing and furniture and stuff like that to keep her body hidden.
And the next night, according to Miss Suk, she buried Linda's body in a nature preserve on the outskirts of Chicago.
She drove for hours all over to find the perfect spot to bury her.
A spot that she led the investigators to early on the morning of September 13th.
She didn't want to come very close to it. In fact, maybe 20, 25 feet is the closest she would get to it.
She didn't want to be confronted again with the terrible act that she'd committed.
But she would have to confront it again in a court of law. Because despite her claims of self-defense, by the time the medical examiner's office had finished exhuming her mother-in-law's body, Miss Suk was back in Bloomington and under arrest for murder.
I was shocked when I found out that Miss Suk was charged with murdering Linda. Very shocked.
There's just no way my mom's not capable of doing that.
Coming up, will the trial reveal Miss Suk's sinister motive?
Linda had a life insurance policy.
Or will a shocking new twist suggest that she's telling the truth?
Miss Suk would not just murder his grandmother in front of him.
On December 10th, 2012, Miss Suk Wang stood trial for murder in Bloomington, Illinois. Arrested in 2011, the 47-year-old mother of two was charged with the murder of her 70-year-old mother-in-law, Linda Tida, a translator and advocate for Chicago's Chinese community.
The community was horrified by what happened to Linda.
Although no one was more shocked than Larry Tida, who'd been Linda's husband for a mere 8 months.
I never thought Miss Suk would ever do anything to Linda like that. I thought they were friends.
But Miss Suk had done it. In fact, she had basically confessed to the police.
After hours of talking, she admitted to murdering her mother-in-law.
Although, in Miss Suk's version of events, it wasn't murder, it was self-defense.
In her opinion, they were mutual combatants.
A fight that Ms. Sook said began as a violent argument over her husband's alleged affair.
I think Ms. Sook was upset, extremely angry, that Linda wouldn't take her side in this supposed extramarital affair.
But was that really what happened? In their opening statement, the prosecution said it was true that a divorce had been in Don and Ms. Sook's future.
Don was going to divorce Ms. Sook. Probably he was going to file for the divorce when he returned from his trip from California.
And according to the prosecution, it wasn't over Don's so-called affair with his mother's assistant, Jenny.
When talking with Don and Jenny, it was just a friendship, platonic friendship, no sort of physical aspect to it whatsoever, or romantic aspect.
But if Don wasn't leaving Ms. Sook for Jenny, why get divorced? To explain, the prosecutors put Don on the stand, and he told the jury that the marriage had initially been a good one.
From the beginning, it seemed like they were a happy family.
But Don testified that they became less happy with each passing year.
Ms. Sook's lust for material gain, for wealth, started to consume the marriage. She liked wealth. She liked nice clothes. She liked nice cars.
She always wanted this. She always wanted that. She needed more of everything.
Ms. Sook also wanted people to know that she had money.
Even if that wasn't technically true.
She was just charging everything on her credit cards. So it created a lot of debt with opening new credit cards up and maxing them out.
Don said that Ms. Sook's spending soon led to trouble.
She had a more extravagant lifestyle than I think Don liked, and I think they did have quite a bit of disputes about money.
Her materialism, her wanting of wealth, and the fights they were having about money put a strain on the relationship.
In fact, Don claimed that Ms. Sook's materialism eventually pushed the marriage to the breaking point.
Ms. Sook had a penchant to steal things.
She got arrested for her shoplifting a month or two before the murder.
Don testified that he and his mother had been embarrassed by the arrest.
They refused to post bond for her.
Don said that Ms. Sook had been furious, so mad that when she did get out, she'd gone to the bank and cleaned out the couple's joint checking account.
She basically raided the checking account for thousands of dollars.
Don testified that the theft had been the final push he needed to file for divorce. And the prosecution believed the missing money would also play a crucial role in his mother's murder. According to the prosecution, the key pieces of evidence were a series of jailhouse letters Ms. Sook wrote to her daughter and several Korean friends while she was awaiting trial.
All of her correspondence was in Korean, and I think she felt that we would not be able to know what she was saying because she was saying it in Korean.
But she was wrong.
We had an assistant in our office who was Korean.
And the prosecutors claimed that those letters, translations of which were provided to the jury, revealed the true motive behind Linda's murder.
In her letters, Ms. Sook spoke about the fact that Linda had a life insurance policy that Don was the beneficiary of.
If something happened to Linda, Don would get all this money.
But not all of it.
Ms. Sook believed that if Linda died, she would be entitled to at least half of that life insurance policy in a divorce settlement.
And the result was a murder plot, according to the prosecutors.
It was not something that just happened spontaneously. It was not something that was an accident.
She was willing to do whatever it took to make sure that she was financially set.
And on September 4th, she'd asked the waitress to place the call that set up the ambush.
Ms. Sook had paid her $20.
But according to the prosecutors, the real bait was the money Ms. Sook stole from Don's checking account.
A lot of the money that was put into that checking account was from Linda.
The prosecutors claimed that was how Ms. Sook was able to lure Linda from the grocery store parking lot to the sewing shop where the murder occurred.
Linda was following her because she promised to pay Linda the money that she owed her that she had taken out of the checking account.
and Miss Sook's claim of self-defense? The prosecution countered that by putting the medical examiner on the stand, who testified that in order to kill Linda, Miss Sook would have to keep strangling her mother-in-law long after the 70-year-old had gone unconscious.
The threat would have been over with, and yet Mizook continued to choke Linda Tida to her death.
Self-defense ends when someone can't fight back anymore.
But according to the prosecutors, the most chilling thing about the murder was the fact that Miss Sook didn't commit the crime alone.
Her poor 5-year-old son was with her the whole time.
He's sitting in the car, and I can't imagine what was going through his head.
Would that sickening revelation turn the jury against her?
I don't know how a person allows their child to witness such a violent act against the child's grandmother.
Or would it strengthen Miss Sook's claim that the crime wasn't premeditated, that she'd killed Linda in self-defense?
Mizook would not just murder his grandmother in front of him.
And to prove that Miss Sook wasn't the monster that the prosecutors made her out to be, the defense called her to the stand on December 17th.
If anybody was in her situation, they would want their voice to be heard.
Through tears, Miss Sook admitted to luring Linda to the parking lot. But she also claimed that murder wasn't what she'd had in mind.
She said, I just wanted to talk to her and say I'm sorry.
Miss Sook said that she'd been shocked by what happened next.
When she got to the sewing shop, according to Miss Sook, that's when Linda attacked her.
It was just a fight that went wrong and it resulted in Linda's death.
And according to Miss Sook, she'd had no choice.
She felt like this was a life or death situation.
But if that was true, why not call the police afterwards? Miss Sook claimed that she feared losing her 5-year-old son.
She didn't know what was going to happen with him. Will I ever get to see him again?
It was emotional and powerful testimony.
Just sitting there, I felt so helpless for my mom. I felt so bad for her.
But would the jury share her daughter's sympathy? Coming up, will Miss Sook go to prison?
Whatever she got, she deserved.
Or will she go free?
It really came down to just one thing, and one thing only.
On December 18, 2012, the jury in Miss Sook Wang's murder trial announced that it had reached a verdict. The 47-year-old mother of 2 was charged with first-degree murder, accused of strangling her mother-in-law, 70-year-old Linda Tida.
The evidence really was overwhelming and really came down to just one thing, and one thing only. Do you believe that Mizook was acting in self-defense or not?
On the stand, Miss Sook had tearfully made the case for self-defense.
She didn't do it out of spite. She didn't do it out of hate.
But the prosecutors claimed that Miss Sook had been motivated by anger and greed.
Don was the sole beneficiary of his mom's insurance policy, and if their marriage ended up in divorce, she would be entitled to, in her opinion, 50% of it.
She gets revenge on the mother, she gets revenge on Dom, and she gets the ability to be financially set and secure.
And now, after just 2.5 hours of deliberation, the jury had made its decision.
It didn't take the jury long, based upon the evidence that we had, to come back and return with a guilty verdict of first-degree murder.
Miss Sook broke down when the verdict was read.
Ms. Zook seemed very beside herself. That's what I thought. Like she had been through hell.
And her friends and family were just as surprised.
I wasn't thinking that she was going to get, first degree.
I think she should have been convicted of manslaughter.
At her sentencing hearing on March 1st, Miss Sook received a total of 55 years in prison.
Miss Zook was sentenced to 50 years for the murder and 5 years for burying the body.
And the fact that the 47-year-old had essentially been put away for the rest of her life suited Linda's grieving husband just fine.
She never apologized to me or anything like that, or said anything to me about she's sorry that she did it. I'd probably never forgive her for what she's done. Whatever she got, she deserved.
Ms. Zook tore apart her family with this act.
Although even after the conviction,
In the summer of 1985, authorities began looking more closely at a small religious community gathered around a farm near Rouleau, Nebraska. From the outside, it could have appeared to be an isolated group of people preparing for what they believed was an approaching apocalypse. They had weapons and ammunition. They had supplies. They lived according to beliefs that were increasingly separated from the society around them. But beneath that surface was something far more disturbing. 2 people had died inside the community. One was a 5-year-old boy named Luke Stice. The other was a 26-year-old man named James Thim. Their deaths would eventually expose a system in which religious extremism, personal authority, fear, punishment, and violence had become tightly intertwined. At the center of that system was Michael W. Ryan. Ryan was not simply another member of the group. He had established himself as its dominant figure, claiming that he could receive direct guidance from Yahweh. Decisions that might ordinarily have belonged to individuals or families could therefore be transformed into something far more difficult to challenge. If Ryan said something was necessary, it could be presented not as Ryan's personal decision, but as the will of God. That distinction would become crucial to understanding what happened at the farm. The story of the Rouleau cult murders is therefore not simply a story about 2 deaths. It is a story about how a small community could become isolated enough, and how one man's authority could become powerful enough that acts of cruelty could be treated as punishment rather than crime. And when the authorities eventually uncovered what had happened, they would find that the graves were only the beginning of the story. To understand how 2 people came to die on that Nebraska farm, it is necessary to go back to Michael Ryan himself. Ryan had been born in Nebraska in 1948. He left school before graduating and worked at various jobs, including as a truck driver. During the 1980s, his religious and political views became increasingly extreme. He became connected with ideas associated with Christian identity and the anti-government posse Comitatus movement. One important influence was James Wickstrom, a figure associated with Posse Comitatus who promoted anti-government and white supremacist ideas through a radical religious framework. Ryan absorbed elements of that world and eventually developed a group of his own. What made Ryan especially dangerous was not simply the extremity of his beliefs. It was the authority he claimed within the community. Ryan said that he had a direct relationship with Yahweh. In practice, that claim meant that his own decisions could acquire the appearance of divine commands. The group used a practice known as the arm test to seek answers to questions. The procedure itself was simple. A person's arm would be held in a particular position while pressure was applied. Depending on whether the arm remained in place or moved, the result could be interpreted as a yes or a no. Within Ryan's belief system, however, the result was treated as an answer from Yahweh. The implications were enormous. A question about an ordinary matter could be submitted to the test, but the same system could also be used to justify decisions about discipline, behavior, and punishment. Ryan therefore had something more powerful than ordinary persuasion. He had a mechanism that allowed his preferences to be presented as divine instructions. A person who disagreed with Ryan was no longer simply disagreeing with another human being. They could be portrayed as resisting the will of Yahweh itself. By the middle of the 1980s, Ryan's followers had gathered around a farm near Rouleau, in Richardson County, southeastern Nebraska. The farm belonged to Rick Stice. By around August 1984, the community had become established there, and at one point more than 20 people lived in buildings around the property. There were adults, but there were also children, The farm was becoming an isolated community with its own hierarchy, beliefs, and rules. Ryan's followers believed that a catastrophic conflict, an Armageddon, was approaching. They prepared for it by accumulating weapons and ammunition along with food, supplies, machinery, and other property. The community was also connected to thefts in Nebraska, Missouri, and Kansas, including the taking of livestock, agricultural machinery, and other property. To those outside the group, these acts were crimes. Within Ryan's worldview, however, the activities could be incorporated into a larger narrative about survival and preparation for the coming conflict. That difference in interpretation was another part of Ryan's power. Actions that would normally be recognized as criminal could be reframed as necessary acts carried out for the community. The farm increasingly became a world in itself. Ryan's influence did not stop at ideology. He developed a hierarchy in which some members held higher status while others were degraded and treated as slaves. Among those who became vulnerable within this system were Rick Stice and his young son Luke. James Thim would later occupy a similarly diminished position. The system depended on obedience. It also depended on fear. Members who were perceived as disloyal or insufficiently committed could be punished and humiliated. The religious language surrounding those punishments made them especially difficult to resist. If Ryan's authority was believed to come directly from Yahweh, then resisting him could be portrayed as resisting a higher power. For adults who had already entered the closed world of the community, leaving or challenging that authority could be extraordinarily difficult. For a 5-year-old child, the imbalance was absolute. Luke Stice was only 5 years old. He depended entirely on the adults around him. He had no meaningful ability to leave the community, challenge its rules, or protect himself from those who controlled his environment. According to the case information, Luke became the target of punishment within Ryan's system. On March 25, 1985, Ryan struck the child, causing Luke's head to hit a hard object. Luke became unconscious. What followed would become one of the most disturbing facts in the entire case. Luke was not taken to a hospital. No emergency medical response was called. Instead, those inside the community prayed for the child. Luke died. His body was later buried on the property. Outside the farm, the wider world remained unaware of what had happened. Inside the community, people who knew about Luke's death did not immediately report it to authorities. A 5-year-old had died, and the people around him allowed the death to remain hidden. Yet the story did not end with Luke's burial. A little more than a month later, another member of the community would become the victim of an extended campaign of violence. His name was James Thim. He was 26 years old. Like Luke, Thim had been caught inside the hierarchy created by Ryan. But unlike the child's sudden death, what happened to Thim would unfold over a period of days. By the time authorities eventually discovered the two graves, the farm would no longer look like an isolated religious community preparing for Armageddon. It would look like the center of a criminal investigation involving 2 deaths, multiple participants, stolen property, weapons, and a leader whose authority had turned religious belief into a mechanism of control. The first grave belonged to Luke Stice. The second would belong to James Thim. And before the authorities could uncover either one, Michael W., Ryan's community would continue to operate as though the outside world had no idea what was happening behind the boundaries of the farm. Michael W. Ryan did not become the center of the Rulo community overnight. The authority he eventually exercised over the people around him developed gradually through a combination of radical religious beliefs, anti-government ideas, isolation, and a system that allowed his personal decisions to acquire the appearance of divine commands. To understand the deaths of Luke Stice and James Thim, it is necessary to understand the man whose influence shaped the environment in which both men died. Ryan was born in Nebraska in 1948. He left school before graduating and later worked at various jobs, including driving trucks. During the early 1980s, his worldview became increasingly extreme. He moved toward a combination of religious and political ideas associated with Christian identity and the anti-government posse comitatus movement. These were not simply private beliefs held in isolation. They formed part of a larger ideological environment in which government authority was rejected, social institutions were regarded with suspicion, and religious concepts were intertwined with political and racial extremism. Ryan came into contact with James Wickstrom, an influential figure associated with posse comitatus. Wickstrom promoted anti-government ideas and connected them to Christian identity, a radical religious ideology containing anti-Semitic and white supremacist beliefs. Ryan absorbed elements of this environment and eventually developed a community in which he himself became the central authority. But Ryan's importance within the group did not depend solely on his political opinions. His most consequential claim was religious. Ryan said that he had a direct connection with Yahweh. That claim transformed the nature of his relationship with his followers. A political leader can be questioned. A religious teacher can be challenged. But someone who claims to speak directly for God occupies a very different position. If Ryan said that something was his personal preference, another member could theoretically disagree. If Ryan said that Yahweh had commanded something, disagreement could be presented as an act of disobedience against God. This distinction became one of the foundations of the community's internal power structure. Ryan's followers accepted a practice known as the arm test as a way of seeking answers to questions. The method was physically simple. A person extended an arm, while pressure was applied to it after a question had been posed. If the arm remained in position, the result could be interpreted as yes. If it moved downward, the result could be interpreted as no. Within Ryan's system, however, the significance was not physical. The result was presented as an indication of Yahweh's will. That meant the arm test could become much more than a religious exercise. It could influence decisions about ordinary life, behavior, food, fasting, and punishment. Once the members accepted the premise that the result represented a divine answer, Ryan possessed a mechanism through which his authority could reach into almost every aspect of their lives. He did not have to convince everyone through an argument. The decision could simply be attributed to Yahweh. This was particularly significant when the answer involved discipline. A punishment could be presented not as something Ryan wanted to impose, but as something that God required. A member who resisted could therefore be portrayed as resisting the same authority that the community claimed to worship. In this way, the distinction between religious belief and Ryan's personal authority became increasingly difficult to separate. By the middle of the 1980s, Ryan's followers had gathered around a farm near Rouleau, in Richardson County, southeastern Nebraska. The property belonged to Rick Stice. By approximately August 1984, the community had taken shape, and at one point more than 20 people lived in buildings around the farm. There were adults, but there were also children. The group was becoming a closed environment with its own hierarchy, beliefs, and expectations. The outside world remained physically close, but socially the community was moving in another direction. Ryan and his followers believed that Armageddon was approaching. They expected a catastrophic conflict and believed they needed to prepare for it. Weapons and ammunition were accumulated. Food and other supplies were gathered. Machinery and other property became part of the resources surrounding the community. The group was also connected to thefts in Nebraska, Missouri, and Kansas. Livestock, agricultural equipment, and other property were taken, with some of those items brought back to the community. Within the worldview promoted by Ryan, these activities could be incorporated into the larger idea of preparing for the coming conflict. The group's behavior was therefore increasingly separated from ordinary social and legal expectations. But the weapons and stolen property were not the most disturbing element of the community. The most dangerous development was the hierarchy forming among the people themselves. Ryan divided members according to status. Some were treated as having greater authority or importance. Others were degraded and treated as slaves. Among those who eventually found themselves in this vulnerable position were Rick Stice and his son, Luke. James Thim would later experience a similar loss of status. The significance of this hierarchy becomes clearer when considering how punishment functioned inside the group. A person who was considered disobedient or insufficiently faithful could be humiliated or physically punished. Because Ryan's authority was presented as religious authority, punishment could be framed as something more than discipline. It could be represented as correction demanded by Yahweh. The system therefore combined social pressure with religious justification. Once a person accepted the premise that Ryan could receive divine instructions, the normal boundary between personal authority and religious command disappeared. This environment helps explain why other members participated in actions that would later become central to the criminal investigation. Ryan was not necessarily required to carry out every act himself. He could give instructions, establish the rules, and define what behavior was considered acceptable. Others could then act within the system he had created. That distinction would become particularly important after James Thim was targeted. But before Thim's final days, there was another victim. Luke Stice was only 5 years old. He was the son of Rick Stice, whose property had become the center of Ryan's community. Luke's age made the imbalance of power particularly stark. He was a child living within a system controlled by adults who accepted Ryan's authority. He had no meaningful ability to leave the community, challenge its beliefs, or protect himself from punishment. According to the case information, Luke eventually became subject to Ryan's disciplinary system. On March 25, 1985, Ryan struck the child, causing Luke's head to hit a hard object. Luke became unconscious. At that moment, the community faced a decision that would reveal the depth of the isolation surrounding the group. Luke needed medical attention. Instead, he was not taken to a hospital. No emergency response was called. Those inside the community prayed for him. Luke died. His body was later buried on the farm. The death was not immediately reported to authorities. The people who knew what had happened remained inside the closed environment that Ryan had built. For the outside world, Luke had effectively disappeared. His death would remain hidden until investigators eventually uncovered what had happened on the property. Ryan would later face a separate criminal charge for Luke's death and, on July 28, 1986, would enter a plea of no contest to second-degree murder. But Luke's death was not the final act of violence at the farm. Less than 2 months after the child died, another member of the community would become the focus of an even more prolonged and brutal series of attacks. His name was James Thim. Thim was 26 years old. He was an adult, but within Ryan's hierarchy, he had become vulnerable. His position deteriorated as Ryan came to regard him as disloyal. In the world Ryan had created, a loss of status could have consequences far beyond social rejection. It could lead to punishment, humiliation, and physical violence. By the time investigators would eventually reconstruct what happened, the story of James Thim would become the central criminal case against Ryan. The events that followed would demonstrate that Luke's death had not been an isolated act. It was part of a broader system in which Ryan's authority had become powerful enough to turn punishment into organized violence. The farm near Rouleau was no longer simply a place where a small group of extremists had gathered. It had become a closed community in which one man's religious claims could determine how other people lived, how they were treated, and ultimately whether they survived. And James Thim was about to experience that system at its most extreme. By the spring of 1985, the community surrounding Michael W. Ryan had already developed the characteristics that would later make the Rouleau case so disturbing. Ryan occupied the center of the group's religious and social structure. He claimed a direct connection with Yahweh, and the arm test had become a method through which decisions could be presented as divine instructions. The community was preparing for an anticipated Armageddon, accumulating weapons and supplies, and becoming increasingly isolated from the society outside the farm. Inside that environment, members were not treated equally. Ryan had established a hierarchy in which some people possessed greater status, while others were degraded and treated as slaves. James Thim was one of the people who eventually fell into that lower position. Thim was 26 years old. He was not an outsider who had wandered onto the property. He was a member of the community. That fact is essential to understanding the tragedy that followed. The violence against Thim did not begin as a random encounter between strangers. It developed inside a community where Ryan already possessed authority over the people around him. According to the case information, Ryan came to regard Thim as disloyal. In the structure Ryan had created, loyalty was not merely a matter of personal friendship. It was connected to religious obedience. To be viewed as insufficiently loyal could mean being viewed as someone who had rejected the authority of Ryan and, through Ryan's interpretation, the authority of Yahweh. Thim's position within the community deteriorated. He became vulnerable to punishment and humiliation. What followed was not a brief confrontation. It became a prolonged period of abuse involving Ryan and other members of the group. According to the federal court records summarized in the case information, Thim was tortured for 3 days before his death. The violence involved severe physical abuse, humiliation, sexual abuse, and other forms of torture. The details are disturbing, but the central fact is more important than any graphic description. James Thim did not die as the result of an isolated moment of uncontrolled violence. He was subjected to sustained abuse by multiple people while Ryan occupied the central position in the events. That distinction became critical at trial. The prosecution's case was not simply that Ryan had been present when Thim died. It was that Ryan had played a leading role in a deliberate process of violence. The involvement of other members also revealed how deeply Ryan's authority had penetrated the community. Among those drawn into the abuse was Ryan's own son, Dennis Ryan. Dennis was approximately 15 years old at the time. His participation became one of the most troubling aspects of the case because it demonstrated how Ryan's influence extended into his own family. According to testimony later presented at trial, Dennis participated in acts against Thim under his father's direction. The involvement of a teenager in the abuse of another member was not treated as an isolated family matter. It became part of the prosecution's evidence concerning the structure of authority inside the group. Other members were also implicated. The names that appeared in the legal proceedings included Timothy Haverkamp, James Haverkamp, and John David Andreas. Their roles differed, and some eventually cooperated with prosecutors. Their cooperation would later become extremely important because the state needed testimony from people who had been inside the community and who could explain what had happened to Thim. These witnesses provided a picture of events that would have been difficult to reconstruct from physical evidence alone. The prosecution could point not only to the death itself, but to the relationships among the people who had been present. For investigators, however, the immediate challenge was that nobody outside the community had yet been given a clear account of what had happened. Thim's death remained hidden. The same was true of Luke Stice's death. The farm remained a closed environment, and the people who knew the truth had powerful reasons to remain silent. Ryan's religious authority was one of those reasons. His system had taught followers to accept his decisions as connected to divine authority. Fear of punishment and fear of opposing the group reinforced that structure. The result was an environment in which extraordinary violence could take place without an immediate report to law enforcement. On April 29, 1985, James Thim died. He was 26 years old. His death followed approximately 3 days of torture. His body was buried in a shallow grave on the property. By then, 2 people had died inside Ryan's community in the space of little more than a month. Luke Stice, a 5-year-old child, and James Thim, a 26-year-old adult. Neither death had been reported to authorities. The community continued to exist as though the outside world did not know what had happened. Yet events outside the farm were beginning to move in a direction that would eventually expose the group. The first major break came not from a homicide report, but from another type of criminal investigation. On June 25, 1985, John David Andreas and James Haverkamp were arrested in connection with the transportation of stolen agricultural equipment. Their arrests brought increased attention to the group. What had previously been viewed as isolated criminal activity began to connect back to the community around Ryan. Authorities started looking more closely at the property and the people living there. The investigation gradually revealed that the group possessed far more than religious materials. There were weapons, large quantities of ammunition, stolen property, and structures associated with the group's preparations. Investigators also encountered material connected with the ideological world surrounding Ryan, including documents and propaganda associated with posse comitatus and Christian identity. These discoveries changed the nature of the investigation. The authorities were no longer dealing with a simple theft case. They were looking at an isolated community with weapons, radical beliefs, and evidence of organized criminal activity. The possibility that something more serious had occurred inside the community became increasingly difficult to ignore. During August 1985, authorities searched the property. The investigation focused on the land and structures surrounding the farm. On August 17th and 18th, investigators uncovered 2 shallow graves. What they found inside transformed the case. One grave contained the remains of Luke Stice. The other contained the remains of James Thim. The discoveries confirmed what the outside world had not known. 2 people had died within the community, and their bodies had been concealed on the property. The investigation immediately became a homicide case. The graves provided physical evidence that could not be explained away by religious belief or political ideology. Luke was a child who had died after being struck by Ryan. Thim was an adult who had been subjected to days of torture before his death. Both had been buried rather than reported. The investigators now had to determine what had happened to each victim, and most importantly, who was responsible. The evidence would eventually point toward Ryan as the central figure in both deaths. But the case would not depend only on the graves. The authorities had also gained access to a community in which multiple people had witnessed or participated in events surrounding Thim's death. Some of those people would later cooperate with prosecutors. Their testimony would help reconstruct the final days of James Thim's life and the role played by Ryan and others. For the prosecution, this would become one of the most important elements of the case. Ryan could not simply be portrayed as a man with unusual religious beliefs. The state would have to establish what he had done, what he had ordered, and how his relationship with the other members contributed to Thim's death. The investigation was therefore moving from the physical evidence of the graves toward the human evidence inside the community, and that evidence would reveal a disturbing pattern. Ryan had created a system in which obedience could be demanded in the name of Yahweh. Punishment could be justified as religious necessity, and other members could be directed to participate in acts of violence. James Thim had become the ultimate victim of that system. The discovery of his grave did not end the story. It opened the door to the courtroom. Before a jury, prosecutors would attempt to reconstruct the 3 days in which Thim had been tortured, identify the people who had participated, and establish Ryan's responsibility for the killing. At the same time, Ryan's defense would confront another question: whether his extreme religious beliefs and mental state made him legally responsible for what he had done. The battle over that question would become one of the central issues of the trial. But before that battle could begin, the state had to show the jury what had happened inside the isolated community near Rouleau. The shallow graves had revealed the victims. The testimony of former members would reveal the system that had surrounded them. The discovery of 2 shallow graves on the farm near Rouleau transformed the investigation. Until that point, authorities had been dealing with a community connected to stolen agricultural equipment, weapons, ammunition, and extremist beliefs. Now they knew that 2 people had died there. and that their bodies had been buried on the property rather than reported to authorities. One victim was a 5-year-old child. The other was a 26-year-old man. The question confronting investigators was no longer simply what kind of community Michael W. Ryan had created. It was what had happened to Luke Stice and James Thim, and how many people inside the community knew about it. The investigation had begun with circumstances that appeared unrelated to homicide. On June 25, 1985, John David Andreas and James Haverkamp had been arrested in connection with the transportation of stolen agricultural equipment. That investigation brought law enforcement's attention toward the group around Ryan. As authorities examined the community more closely, they found evidence that its activities extended well beyond its religious beliefs. Weapons and large quantities of ammunition were present. Stolen property had been brought into the community. There were structures and preparations associated with the group's belief that an approaching Armageddon required them to be ready for conflict. Investigators also encountered documents, recordings, and propaganda connected with the ideological world that had influenced Ryan, including material associated with posse comitatus and Christian identity. These discoveries provided important context, but they did not by themselves prove murder. The investigation had to establish what had happened to the two people whose bodies had been concealed on the land. The search of the property in August became the decisive turning point. On August 17th and 18th, authorities searched the farm and discovered 2 shallow graves. The remains were identified as those of Luke Stice and James Thim. The location of the bodies was critical. Neither victim had simply died somewhere outside the community and been brought onto the property by accident. Their deaths were connected to the closed world Ryan had established there. The investigators now had physical evidence that 2 deaths had occurred, but the graves alone could not tell the entire story. They needed witnesses. They needed to understand the hierarchy inside the community. They needed to know who had been present when Luke died, who had participated in the abuse of James Thim, and what Ryan had instructed the others to do. This was where the people inside the community became central to the investigation. The authorities were not dealing with a conventional crime scene in which the suspect had acted alone. Multiple members had been connected to the events surrounding Thim's death. Several of them would eventually face criminal charges. The legal proceedings would identify Michael W. Ryan, Dennis Ryan, Timothy Haverkamp, James Haverkamp, and John David Andreas as people connected to the case. Their individual roles were not identical. Some eventually cooperated with prosecutors and agreed to testify in exchange for lighter punishment. That cooperation provided the state with something extremely valuable: witnesses who could describe the internal workings of the community and the treatment of Thim from inside the group. The prosecution could therefore begin reconstructing events through the testimony of people who had been there. Their evidence helped establish that Thim had not died during a single spontaneous confrontation. According to the information presented in the case, Ryan and 4 other people tortured Thim for 3 days before his death on April 29, 1985. The abuse included severe physical violence, humiliation, and sexual abuse. The prosecution's theory was that Ryan occupied the central position in this violence. The involvement of other members was not incidental. It demonstrated the extent to which Ryan's authority had influenced the people around him. Among the participants was Dennis Ryan, Michael's teenage son. Dennis was approximately 15 years old. His involvement would later become particularly significant because he could provide evidence concerning his father's conduct and instructions. The case therefore contained an unusual and disturbing element. The prosecution could call people from inside Ryan's own community, including his son, to describe what had happened. One witness, Cheryl Gibson, later testified that Michael Ryan and Dennis Ryan had laughed about Thim's death. That testimony became part of the broader picture presented by prosecutors. The state was attempting to show the jury not merely that Thim had died, but that Ryan had exercised control over the circumstances leading to his death. At the same time, investigators had to consider Luke Stice's death separately. Luke was 5 years old when Ryan struck him on March 25, 1985, causing the child's head to hit a hard object. Luke became unconscious. Instead of being taken to a hospital, he was placed in a bed while people in the community prayed for him. He died, and his body was later buried on the property. The discovery of Luke's remains provided investigators with physical confirmation of a death that had never been reported. Ryan would eventually face a separate prosecution for that death. The legal treatment of Luke's case would differ from that of Thim. Ryan ultimately entered a plea of no contest to second-degree murder in Luke's death on July 28, 1986. But at the investigation stage, both deaths presented the same fundamental problem. People inside the community had allowed them to remain hidden. That silence became an important part of understanding the environment Ryan had created. The investigation also revealed the extent of the group's preparation for the future it believed was coming. Weapons and ammunition were not merely incidental possessions. They were connected to the community's expectation of an apocalyptic conflict. Stolen agricultural equipment and other property demonstrated that the group was also willing to violate the law outside its religious activities. The combination of weapons, radical ideology, criminal activity, and evidence of 2 deaths made the farm a profoundly different environment from the isolated religious community it might initially have appeared to be. Investigators were now looking at a closed organization whose internal rules had become more important to some members than the laws of the society surrounding them. This context would later matter when Ryan's mental state became an issue in court. His defense would argue that his extreme beliefs reflected serious psychological problems and would rely on an insanity defense. The prosecution, however, would argue that unusual beliefs did not necessarily mean that Ryan lacked legal responsibility for his actions. The investigators, therefore, had to distinguish between what Ryan believed and what he deliberately did. That distinction would become one of the most important questions in the entire case. A person could hold extreme religious beliefs without automatically being legally incapable of understanding the consequences of his actions. The prosecution would seek to demonstrate that Ryan could make decisions, give instructions, organize the behavior of others, and participate in a coordinated system of punishment. The witnesses from inside the community would help establish that picture. Their testimony also revealed why the case could not be understood simply as the actions of a solitary killer. Ryan had created a hierarchy. He had claimed divine authority. Other people followed his instructions. Some participated directly in violence. Others remained silent. Several eventually became defendants themselves. The resulting structure was one in which responsibility extended beyond a single moment and beyond a single individual. Yet Ryan remained at the center of the prosecution's case. As investigators assembled the evidence, the 2 victims also emerged as distinct human stories rather than merely names in a criminal file. Luke Stice was a 5-year-old child who had been completely dependent on adults within the community. James Thim was 26 and had been a member of the group before becoming the target of sustained violence. Their circumstances were different, but both had been caught within the same system of authority. Both died on the same isolated property. Both were buried there, and both deaths remained concealed until investigators uncovered the graves. By the time the investigation reached its most important stage, authorities had established the essential framework of the case. There was a community led by Michael W. Ryan. There was evidence of radical religious and political beliefs. There were weapons, ammunition, and stolen property. There were 2 graves. There were multiple people connected to the events, and there were witnesses prepared to describe what had happened inside the community. The next challenge was to take that evidence into a courtroom and prove Ryan's criminal responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt. That would require the prosecution to reconstruct the death of James Thim in detail, explain the role of the other participants, and confront the defense's argument that Ryan's mental state made him legally insane. The farm near Rouleau had revealed its secret slowly. The graves had identified the victims. The witnesses would begin to explain the violence. And in 1986, the evidence would finally be placed before a jury. By the time Michael W. Ryan stood before a jury in 1986, the investigation had already transformed the farm near Rouleau from an isolated religious community into the center of a murder case. 2 graves had been discovered on the property. The remains were those of 5-year-old Luke Stice and 26-year-old James Thim. Several members of the community had become defendants, and some had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. The state now had to transform a complicated collection of testimony, physical evidence, and competing explanations into a case that could establish Ryan's responsibility for Thim's death beyond a reasonable doubt. The trial focused primarily on James Thim. Ryan was charged with first-degree murder in connection with Thim's death. The prosecution's case rested heavily on the testimony of people who had been inside Ryan's community. Their evidence was important because the most significant events had occurred away from public view. There had been no ordinary witnesses from outside the group standing nearby when Thim was abused. The people who knew what happened were members of Ryan's own circle. Some of those people had themselves been implicated in the crime. Their cooperation, therefore, carried both value and complexity. They could describe events from personal knowledge, but there were also people seeking reduced punishment for their own involvement. The jury had to consider what they said and determine how much weight their testimony deserved. What emerged from the testimony was a picture of sustained violence rather than a spontaneous killing. James Thim had been subjected to abuse for approximately 3 days before his death on April 29, 1985. The acts described in the case included severe physical abuse, humiliation, and sexual violence. The prosecution argued that Ryan was not simply another participant. He occupied the central position in the group and exercised authority over the people around him. That authority had been built through his religious claims. Ryan had told followers that he could communicate directly with Yahweh. The arm test provided a mechanism through which decisions could be represented as divine instructions. Within that structure, punishment could be presented as religiously justified. The prosecution therefore sought to show the jury that the violence against Thim occurred within a system Ryan had created and controlled. One of the most significant people connected to the prosecution's case was Dennis Ryan, Michael Ryan's son. Dennis was approximately 15 years old when Thim was tortured. According to the case information, he participated in acts against Thim under his father's direction. His involvement was significant not simply because he was a participant, but because he was Ryan's own child. The prosecution could use his testimony to describe what his father did and how instructions were given inside the community. Another witness, Cheryl Gibson, testified that Michael Ryan and Dennis Ryan later laughed about Thim's death. The testimony contributed to the prosecution's effort to portray Ryan as someone who understood what had happened and did not regard the death as an accident or an unavoidable consequence of a chaotic confrontation. Other members, including Timothy Haverkamp, John David Andreas, and James Haverkamp, were also connected to the case. Some received reduced punishment after agreeing to testify for the state. Their cooperation helped prosecutors reconstruct the internal sequence of events and establish the participation of several people. This was important because the defense could potentially argue that Ryan was being blamed for actions committed by others. The prosecution therefore needed to establish his individual responsibility. The evidence was presented in the context of a community in which Ryan had enormous influence. He was not merely present. He had developed the ideology, established the hierarchy, and claimed the authority to determine what Yahweh wanted. The state argued that this authority was directly relevant to the actions that culminated in Thim's death. But Ryan's defense had another argument available. His religious beliefs were extreme. and his claim of communicating with Yahweh could be interpreted as evidence of serious mental disturbance. The defense therefore pursued an insanity defense. This introduced a difficult question into the trial. Could Ryan be held legally responsible if he genuinely believed that his actions were required by a divine authority? The issue was not simply whether Ryan's beliefs were unusual. They clearly were. The legal question was whether his mental condition prevented him from understanding the nature or wrongfulness of his conduct under the applicable legal standard. Psychiatric experts were called to address that issue. Experts for the defense described Ryan as having serious psychological problems and pointed to his unusual religious beliefs. Their testimony sought to place his conduct within the context of his mental state. If the jury accepted that Ryan was legally insane, the consequences would be fundamentally different from an ordinary murder conviction. The prosecution, however, presented experts who reached a different conclusion. One psychiatrist, Dr. Emmett Kinney, characterized Ryan's motivation in terms of sadistic tendencies rather than a mental illness that removed his criminal responsibility. The prosecution's position was essentially that Ryan's beliefs, however extreme, did not automatically make him legally incapable of understanding what he was doing. This distinction became central. A person could believe in Yahweh, believe in divine commands, and even hold deeply distorted religious ideas without necessarily satisfying the legal requirements for an insanity defense. The state sought to show that Ryan was capable of making decisions, directing others, and functioning within an organized system. His actions, according to the prosecution, demonstrated planning and control rather than an inability to understand reality. The evidence concerning the community's hierarchy supported this argument. Ryan had not simply acted in a state of confusion. He had developed a structure in which people occupied different positions, had established methods of discipline, and had used the arm test as a way of presenting decisions as divine. The prosecution could argue that this was not evidence of helplessness before a mental disorder. It was evidence of a system through which Ryan exercised power. The distinction was subtle but critical. If Ryan could organize other people, give instructions, and distinguish between obedience and disobedience, then the jury could conclude that he retained the ability to make purposeful choices. The defense nevertheless maintained that his religious beliefs were central to understanding his conduct. The trial therefore became a confrontation between two interpretations of the same evidence. One interpretation saw Ryan as a deeply disturbed man whose religious delusions had overwhelmed his ability to understand his actions. The other saw him as a calculating leader who used extreme religious beliefs as a source of authority while remaining legally responsible for the consequences. The jury ultimately rejected the insanity defense. On April 10, 1986, Michael W. Ryan was convicted of first-degree murder for the death of James Thim. The conviction established his criminal responsibility for the killing and brought the case to the sentencing stage. The prosecution had succeeded in presenting the death not as an inexplicable act committed by a man disconnected from reality, but as the culmination of a system in which Ryan exercised authority over others. The jury's decision also meant that Ryan could face the most severe punishment available under Nebraska law at the time. The sentencing process would bring another layer of controversy to the case. Ryan would eventually receive a death sentence for Thim's murder. But before that sentence became final, there remained a separate legal matter involving the death of Luke Stice. Luke's case had followed a different path. Ryan had not been tried by a jury for Luke's death in the same manner as the Thim case. Instead, on July 28, 1986, he entered a plea of no contest to second-degree murder in connection with Luke's death. The plea resulted in a separate conviction. Thus, by the middle of 1986, Ryan had been held criminally responsible for both deaths. James Thim's death had produced the first-degree murder conviction and would ultimately lead to a death sentence. Luke Stice's death produced a second-degree murder conviction after Ryan's no-contest plea. The legal record now reflected what investigators had uncovered on the farm. 2 people had died within Ryan's community, and Ryan had been held responsible for both. The courtroom had converted the hidden graves and testimony from inside the community into formal criminal judgments. Yet the case was far from finished. A conviction was only the beginning of another long legal process. Ryan's lawyers would challenge the proceedings. His mental competency would remain an issue, and questions would later arise concerning the conduct of the trial judge. The death sentence imposed for Thim's murder would become the subject of repeated appeals and post-conviction proceedings. Ryan would remain alive for nearly 3 more decades, moving through the death row system while his lawyers continued to challenge the convictions and sentence. The trial had answered one question for the state. Michael W. Ryan was legally responsible for James Thim's murder. But the years that followed would raise another question: whether that judgment would ever be carried out. Before that question could be answered, the case would enter a prolonged legal battle involving mental competency, judicial conduct, and the constitutional rights of a condemned prisoner. The Rouleau story had moved from a hidden community to a courtroom. Now it was about to move into the courts of appeal, where the verdict would be examined again and again. The conviction of Michael W. Ryan for the first-degree murder of James Thim marked the end of the trial. But it did not mark the end of the legal battle. On April 10, 1986, a jury found Ryan guilty. The verdict established that, under Nebraska law, Ryan was criminally responsible for Thim's death. Yet the most consequential stage of the case was still ahead. The court now had to determine the punishment. The prosecution had presented Thim's death as the culmination of prolonged and deliberate violence inside Ryan's religious community. The defense had attempted to place Ryan's conduct within the context of his extreme beliefs and mental state. The jury had rejected the insanity defense. The legal system was now faced with the question of whether Ryan should receive the ultimate punishment available under Nebraska law. On October 16, 1986, Judge Robert T. Finn sentenced Michael W. Ryan to death for the murder of James Thim. The sentence meant that Ryan would enter Nebraska's death row system. But even at this point, the case was not simply a matter of carrying out a punishment. A death sentence automatically created another level of legal scrutiny. Ryan's lawyers could challenge the conviction, the sentencing process, and the circumstances surrounding the trial. Over the following years, the courts would examine numerous arguments raised on his behalf. One of the central issues remained Ryan's mental condition. His lawyers continued to argue that his psychological state affected his ability to participate meaningfully in the legal process. His religious beliefs were particularly important to that argument. Ryan had claimed a direct relationship with Yahweh and had organized his community around that belief. To the defense, those convictions raised questions about whether he truly understood the legal proceedings against him. But the courts had to distinguish between religious extremism and legal incompetence. The fact that a defendant holds unusual or disturbing beliefs does not automatically establish that the defendant is incapable of understanding a trial or assisting counsel. This distinction had already been important during the original trial, when the insanity defense was rejected. It continued to matter during the appeals. The legal record later reflected evidence from people who had worked with Ryan's defense. One attorney indicated that Ryan's beliefs about Yahweh did not prevent him from understanding the proceedings, communicating with his lawyers, or participating in his defense. That assessment was significant because it addressed the practical question of competence rather than simply the unusual nature of Ryan's beliefs. The courts were being asked to determine whether Ryan's religious worldview made him legally incapable of participating in the process. The answer, repeatedly, was no. Another issue emerged concerning Judge Robert T. Finn. During later post-conviction proceedings, Ryan's lawyers raised concerns about meetings the judge had held with people connected to the victims outside the presence of Ryan and his attorneys. One meeting occurred on May 9, 1986, before Ryan was sentenced. The defense argued that such contact raised concerns about judicial impartiality and the fairness of the sentencing process. The Nebraska Supreme Court examined the issue in later proceedings. The court acknowledged that the meeting had occurred. However, it concluded that Ryan had not demonstrated that the meeting created sufficient prejudice or actual bias to justify overturning his conviction or sentence. This became one of several examples of the difference between identifying a procedural irregularity and proving that the irregularity caused legally significant harm. Ryan's lawyers continued to challenge the death sentence, but the courts repeatedly refused to invalidate it. The case therefore entered a cycle that would continue for decades. An appeal would be filed, the courts would review the arguments, and the conviction or sentence would remain in place. The length of the process was influenced not only by the number of legal claims, but also by the extraordinary seriousness of the punishment. A death sentence receives extensive judicial review because the consequences are irreversible. Ryan's case involved both state and federal proceedings, and the legal questions surrounding his conviction continued to be examined long after the original trial had ended. In 1989, the Nebraska Supreme Court considered Ryan's case and upheld the conviction and sentence. The decision addressed the arguments raised by the defense and preserved the judgment that Ryan was responsible for Thim's murder. The legal process did not end there. Ryan continued seeking relief through further appeals. In 1990, the United States Supreme Court declined to review the case, leaving the Nebraska judgment intact. Yet Ryan's lawyers continued to pursue post-conviction remedies. These proceedings raised additional questions concerning his mental condition, the fairness of the original proceedings, and other constitutional issues. The passage of time did not erase the conviction. Instead, the case became an increasingly complicated record of repeated attempts to obtain relief from the death sentence. By the 1990s, Ryan had already spent years on death row. His situation illustrated one of the defining features of capital punishment in the United States. The sentence might be imposed in a single courtroom proceeding, but its final resolution could take decades. Each appeal created another opportunity for the defense to argue that something had gone wrong. Each ruling required the courts to determine whether the alleged error justified changing the result. Ryan's case was particularly complex because the original trial had involved questions of mental illness and religious belief. His defense continued to argue that his psychological condition had not been adequately considered. The state, meanwhile, maintained that the legal system had already examined these questions and that Ryan had received the process required by law. The courts repeatedly sided with the state's position. One of the most significant later proceedings occurred in 1999 when the Nebraska Supreme Court reviewed Ryan's post-conviction claims. The court again considered issues involving his mental competency and the meeting between Judge Finn and people connected to the victims. The court concluded that Ryan had not demonstrated grounds sufficient to overturn the conviction or sentence. The significance of these proceedings went beyond the individual arguments. They demonstrated how the case continued to be examined years after the original verdict. Ryan's death sentence remained intact even though his lawyers continued to challenge it. In 2004, the United States Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit rejected another habeas corpus challenge. The federal court considered arguments that included claims concerning the judge's conduct and Ryan's competency. It found no basis for disturbing the decisions of the lower courts. By then, Ryan had spent a substantial portion of his life under a death sentence. The farm near Rouleau had become a distant place in time, but the legal consequences of what happened there remained active. The two victims, Luke Stice and James Thim, had been dead for years. Ryan, however, remained alive, continuing to challenge the judgment against him. The contrast was stark. The victims had no opportunity to appeal what had happened to them. Ryan had access to a legal process that allowed his conviction and sentence to be examined repeatedly. That process was a fundamental part of the justice system, especially in a capital case. But it also meant that the families of the victims faced years of uncertainty. For the relatives of Thim and Stice, the case did not end when the jury returned its verdict. The legal system continued to revisit events that had already caused enormous loss. Ryan's case also became connected to broader disputes surrounding Nebraska's method of execution. As the years passed, Nebraska moved away from the electric chair and toward lethal injection. The availability and legality of the drugs required for executions became another source of litigation. Ryan's lawyers challenged aspects of the state's efforts to obtain and use execution drugs. These disputes contributed to further delays. The death sentence imposed in 1986 therefore became increasingly distant from its possible execution. Ryan remained condemned, but no execution date resulted in a final act of punishment. By the early 21st century, Ryan had spent many years on death row. In 2001, he was moved to Tecumseh State Correctional Institution when Nebraska's death row prisoners were transferred there from the Nebraska State Penitentiary. The physical location changed, but the legal status did not. He remained under sentence of death. The case continued to move through the courts, while disputes surrounding execution procedures added another layer of delay. Nearly 3 decades had passed since the murder of James Thim. Ryan's conviction had survived repeated challenges. His death sentence had survived repeated challenges, yet the state had still not executed him. The reasons were not simple. They included appeals, post-conviction litigation, questions surrounding competency, disputes over judicial conduct, and challenges involving the method of execution. The legal system had moved slowly because each issue required consideration, and because the consequence of error in a capital case was permanent. But another development was approaching, one that would make the question of execution irrelevant. Michael W. Ryan's health was beginning to fail. By 2015, after nearly 30 years on death row, he would face a final outcome that neither his lawyers nor the state had anticipated in the original sentencing process. He would not die by execution. He would die in prison from illness. The man who had received a death sentence in 1986 would never be executed by Nebraska. Instead, the final chapter of Ryan's life would be determined by disease, ending a legal saga that had lasted almost 3 decades. But before that end, the courts would continue to confront the same central questions that had surrounded the case from the beginning. What did Ryan believe? What did he understand? And how responsible was he for the violence carried out inside the community he controlled? The answer of the courts remained consistent. Extreme beliefs did not erase criminal responsibility. The conviction for James Thim's murder stood. The death sentence stood. And Ryan remained on death row, waiting for a punishment that ultimately would never be carried out. For Michael W. Ryan, the death sentence did not produce an immediate ending. It produced a new chapter that would last for almost 3 decades. In 1986, after being convicted of first-degree murder in the death of James Thim, Ryan was sentenced to death. The verdict had brought the courtroom portion of the case to a close, but it did not end the legal process. A capital conviction automatically carried the possibility of extensive review, and Ryan's case became an unusually long struggle through state and federal courts. The questions that had surrounded the trial did not disappear. His mental condition remained an issue. His religious beliefs remained relevant to arguments about his competency. The conduct of the trial judge became the subject of later challenges. And eventually, even the state's chosen method of execution became part of the litigation. During those years, Ryan remained alive while the people whose deaths had brought him before the courts remained permanently gone. James Thim had died on April 29, 1985, after approximately 3 days of severe abuse. Luke Stice had died on March 25, 1985, when he was only 5 years old. Both had been buried on the farm near Rouleau. Ryan, meanwhile, continued to receive the protections of a legal system designed to ensure that a death sentence was imposed and carried out only after the required procedures had been followed. His lawyers continued to challenge the judgment. One of the most persistent questions involved Ryan's mental state. His extreme religious beliefs had been central to the original trial. He claimed that he could receive direct instructions from Yahweh, and his authority within the community was built around that claim. The defense had previously presented an insanity argument, but the jury had rejected it. During the years that followed, the question returned in another form. Was Ryan competent to participate in the legal process itself? Competency and insanity were not identical questions. The issue was not simply whether Ryan had unusual beliefs or psychological problems. The courts had to determine whether those problems prevented him from understanding the proceedings or assisting his attorneys. The record included evidence that people who had worked with Ryan's defense did not believe his religious beliefs prevented him from understanding the legal process. One of his attorneys indicated that Ryan could understand the trial, communicate with counsel, and participate in his defense despite his convictions concerning Yahweh. That distinction remained important because the courts were not being asked to decide whether Ryan's beliefs were ordinary or reasonable. They were being asked whether those beliefs made him legally incapable of participating in his own case. The courts repeatedly concluded that the evidence did not establish such incapacity. Another issue that continued through the appeals concerned Judge Robert T. Finn, who had presided over the case and ultimately imposed the death sentence. Ryan's lawyers challenged the judge's conduct after learning that he had met with people connected to the victims outside the presence of the defense. One meeting occurred on May 9, 1986, before sentencing. The defense argued that this contact raised questions about the judge's impartiality. In a capital case, the appearance of fairness was particularly important. The sentence could not simply be accepted because the defendant had been convicted. The defense therefore argued that the circumstances surrounding sentencing deserved careful examination. The Nebraska Supreme Court considered the issue and acknowledged that the meeting had occurred. But the court did not find that Ryan had demonstrated sufficient prejudice or bias to justify overturning the judgment. That distinction became part of the broader pattern of Ryan's appeals. The courts did not necessarily reject every factual assertion made by the defense. Instead, they repeatedly concluded that the alleged errors did not establish a legal basis for reversing the conviction or sentence. The difference mattered. A procedural concern was not automatically enough to erase a murder conviction. A defendant had to demonstrate that the problem affected the fairness or reliability of the proceedings in a legally significant way. Ryan's lawyers continued to pursue relief, but the conviction survived. In 1989, the Nebraska Supreme Court upheld the judgment. In 1990, the United States Supreme Court declined to review the case. The state and federal courts therefore left the conviction and death sentence intact. But Ryan's legal challenges did not stop. Post-conviction proceedings continued, and the case returned to the courts repeatedly. By the late 1990s, Ryan had spent more than a decade under sentence of death. In 1999, the Nebraska Supreme Court again considered his claims. The court examined arguments involving his competency and the conduct of Judge Finn. Again, Ryan failed to establish grounds that required the conviction or sentence to be overturned. The years were beginning to define the case as much as the original trial had. Ryan's death sentence had been imposed in 1986, but the state had not carried it out. Every appeal created another period of review. Every judicial decision created another opportunity for the defense to seek further relief. For the victims' families, the passage of time created a different reality. A criminal case that had already produced convictions continued to occupy the legal system decades later. The finality that a death sentence appeared to promise in 1986 remained distant. By the early 2000s, the debate surrounding capital punishment in Nebraska had also changed. The state was moving away from the electric chair and toward lethal injection. This change created new legal disputes involving the drugs required to conduct an execution. Ryan's lawyers challenged aspects of the state's efforts to obtain and use execution drugs. These challenges contributed to additional delays. His sentence remained death. But the practical question of when and how that sentence could be carried out became increasingly complicated. In 2001, Ryan was transferred to Tecumseh State Correctional Institution when Nebraska's death row prisoners were moved there from Nebraska State Penitentiary. The transfer changed his physical surroundings, but not his legal position. He remained a condemned prisoner. His name remained associated with one of the most disturbing murder cases in Nebraska's history. The farm near Rouleau was now decades behind him, yet the consequences of what had happened there continued to follow him. The legal process also illustrated the tension inherent in capital punishment. The state had declared that Ryan deserved to die for Thim's murder, but the system was required to provide multiple opportunities for judicial review before taking his life. Those protections were not optional. They existed because an execution could not be undone. If a conviction were wrong, no later appeal could restore the person who had been executed. For that reason, Ryan's repeated challenges had to be considered even though the underlying crimes were horrific. The severity of his conduct did not eliminate his legal rights. At the same time, the repeated appeals meant that the families of the victims continued to live with a case that never completely ended. The legal record grew larger as the years passed. Claims that had once seemed central became part of a much longer history of litigation. The original question, whether Ryan had murdered James Thim, had already been answered by the jury. The later questions concerned whether the trial had been conducted properly, whether Ryan had been competent, whether the sentencing judge had acted impartially, and whether the state could lawfully carry out the death sentence. By 2004, the case had reached another significant federal stage. The United States Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit rejected Ryan's habeas corpus challenge. The court considered arguments involving his competency and the conduct of the trial judge and found no basis for disturbing the lower court's decisions. Again, the conviction remained intact. Again, the death sentence remained intact. But Ryan was still alive. Almost 20 years had passed since the original verdict. He had entered death row as a relatively young man in his late 30s. He was now approaching the later decades of his life. The waiting itself had become a defining feature of his imprisonment. He remained legally condemned, yet no execution date brought the case to its final conclusion. The story of Ryan's death sentence, therefore, became a story about time. In 1986, the sentence had represented an immediate declaration of punishment. By the 2000s, it represented something different, a legal status that could continue for decades while appeals and procedural disputes unfolded. Ryan's lawyers continued to seek relief. The state continued to defend the conviction. Courts continued to review the record. And the victims remained at the center of the reason the case existed at all. Luke Stice would always be 5 years old in the memory of the case. James Thim would always be 26. Their lives ended in 1985. Ryan's continued because the legal system had not yet reached its final point. Then, after years of litigation over mental competency, judicial conduct, and execution procedures, an unexpected factor would change the ending. Ryan's health deteriorated. He developed terminal brain cancer. The man who had spent almost 3 decades under a death sentence would eventually face death for an entirely different reason. Nebraska would never carry out the sentence imposed for James Thim. Michael W. Ryan would die in prison before the state could execute him. That outcome would bring an end to his personal story, but it would not erase the questions left by the Rouleau case. The deaths of Luke Stice and James Thim remained the central facts. The community Ryan created remained an example of how religious extremism, personal authority, isolation, and obedience could become intertwined with violence. And the decades of litigation demonstrated that even after a jury reaches a verdict, a capital case can remain alive in the courts for generations. By the time Ryan's health began to fail, nearly 30 years had passed since the graves were discovered and the community's hidden violence had been exposed. The farm near Rouleau had long since ceased to be the center of the investigation. But the legal consequences had followed Ryan through every prison transfer and every appeal. The final question was no longer whether he would remain on death row. It was whether he would survive long enough to face execution. The answer would soon become clear. He would not. By the time Michael W. Ryan entered the final years of his life, almost 3 decades had passed since the murders that had brought his name before the courts. The farm near Rouleau, Nebraska, was now part of the past. The people who had lived within Ryan's small religious community had gone their separate ways, been imprisoned, or appeared as witnesses in the legal proceedings that followed the discovery of the graves. James Thim and Luke Stice were long dead. Yet Ryan remained alive, still under the sentence imposed for Thim's murder in 1986. The extraordinary length of time between sentencing and death had become one of the defining features of the case. Ryan had been sentenced to die, but he was never executed. Instead, his final years unfolded inside the Nebraska prison system while his lawyers continued to challenge the judgment and the state continued to defend it. In 2001, Ryan was transferred to Tecumseh State Correctional Institution when Nebraska's death row prisoners were moved from Nebraska State Penitentiary. The transfer did not change the legal status that had followed him since 1986. He remained a death row prisoner. The sentence imposed by Judge Robert T. Finn remained in force. The conviction for first-degree murder in the death of James Thim remained intact. His separate conviction arising from the death of 5-year-old Luke Stice also remained intact. The legal system had repeatedly reviewed the case, but none of those reviews had produced an order requiring the convictions to be overturned. Ryan's appeals had raised serious questions about his mental condition, his ability to participate in the legal process, the conduct of the sentencing judge, and later the state's methods of carrying out executions. But the courts repeatedly concluded that those arguments did not provide a sufficient legal basis for setting aside the judgment. By this point, the case had become an illustration of the distance that can develop between a death sentence and an execution. A sentence can be imposed in a courtroom on a particular day, while its implementation may remain uncertain for decades. The reason for that delay was not simply one issue. It was the accumulation of legal challenges and procedural safeguards surrounding a capital case. Ryan's lawyers were entitled to continue pursuing available remedies, and the courts were required to examine those claims. The seriousness of the crimes did not remove those rights. At the same time, the passage of years meant that the families of the victims continued to live with a case that never seemed to reach a final conclusion. The people at the center of the original tragedy had no opportunity to recover the lives that had been taken from them. Luke Stice had been 5 years old when he died on March 25, 1985. James Thim had been 26 when he died on April 29th of the same year. Their deaths were permanent. Ryan's sentence, by contrast, remains subject to review. That difference is an unavoidable feature of a legal system that permits appeals in capital cases. Ryan's death sentence also became entangled in the changing debate over execution methods in Nebraska. The state moved toward lethal injection, replacing the electric chair as the method it intended to use. But lethal injection itself generated legal disputes, including questions concerning the drugs required for an execution. Ryan's lawyers challenged aspects of Nebraska's efforts to obtain and use those drugs. These disputes contributed to the continued postponement of any execution. Thus, even after Ryan had spent many years on death row, the state still had not reached the point at which his sentence could be carried out. In another case, the story might have ended with an execution date eventually being established. Ryan's case took a different path. His health began to deteriorate. By 2015, Ryan was suffering from terminal brain cancer. The illness changed the nature of the final chapter. For almost 30 years, the legal system had treated execution as the eventual conclusion of his sentence. Now Ryan's own physical condition was approaching a different conclusion. He was dying. The possibility that Nebraska would execute him was becoming irrelevant because he was unlikely to survive long enough for the state to do so. On May 24, 2015, Michael W. Ryan died at Tecumseh State Correctional Institution. He was 66 years old. He died from illness while still under sentence of death. Nebraska never executed him. The distinction is important. Ryan did not die because the state carried out the punishment imposed in 1986. He died because of terminal brain cancer. The legal sentence, therefore, remained unfulfilled in the literal sense that Ryan never underwent the execution process. For the families of the victims, this created an unusual ending to a case that had already lasted decades. There would be no execution chamber, no final act of state punishment, and no moment when the death sentence was physically carried out. Instead, the man responsible for the convictions died in prison after spending nearly 3 decades waiting for an execution that never occurred. Yet Ryan's death did not resolve every emotional question associated with the case. A criminal judgment can establish responsibility, but it cannot restore a victim's life. Nothing about Ryan's death could change the fact that Luke Stice was killed at 5 years old or that James Thim died after prolonged abuse. The legal record could establish what happened and assign responsibility, but it could not reverse the consequences for their families. That distinction is especially important in a case such as Rouleau, where the crimes occurred within a closed community controlled by a single dominant figure. Ryan's death also brought an end to the possibility of further direct testimony from him. During his lifetime, his religious beliefs had been central to understanding the community he created. He claimed to receive direct instructions from Yahweh. He used the so-called arm test as a way of presenting decisions as divine commands. He had built a hierarchy in which some members possessed greater status while others were treated as servants or slaves. Violence became part of that system. The deaths of Luke and Thim were not isolated events unrelated to the community's internal structure. They emerged from an environment in which Ryan possessed extraordinary authority over other people. That fact became particularly important because several other members were also drawn into the violence against them. Some later cooperated with prosecutors and testified against Ryan. Their participation demonstrated how the influence of the group's leader could extend beyond his own actions. Ryan did not simply commit a crime in isolation. He had created a setting in which other people could become participants in the abuse of another member. His son, Dennis Ryan, was among those drawn into the events surrounding Thim. Dennis was only about 15 years old at the time. The case therefore left behind a complicated picture of responsibility. Ryan was the central figure and the person ultimately convicted of first-degree murder. But the violence involved more than one participant. Other members faced criminal proceedings of their own. Some received lesser sentences after cooperating with the prosecution. Their testimony helped establish what had occurred inside the community. The result was a legal record that extended far beyond one man's actions. It documented a system of obedience, punishment, and violence that had developed within a small group near Rouleau. The broader significance of Ryan's case continued after his death. It was studied in connection with cult violence and the insanity defense because it raised a difficult question: how should the legal system respond when extreme religious beliefs are intertwined with criminal conduct? Ryan's beliefs were undeniably central to the story, but the courts did not accept those beliefs as a sufficient explanation to remove his criminal responsibility. The case demonstrated that an individual can hold extreme or irrational religious convictions while still being legally responsible for deliberate criminal acts. It also showed why the context surrounding a crime can matter. The violence did not emerge from nowhere. Ryan had spent years building a belief system that gave him authority over the people around him. He established rules, defined enemies, demanded obedience, and presented his decisions as the will of Yahweh. Within that environment, punishment could be portrayed as religious duty. The resulting violence ultimately included the deaths of a child and an adult member of the community. When Ryan died in 2015, that entire history became fixed in the past. There would be no further trial, No further appeal by Ryan could change the judgment. No execution would occur. The courts had reached their conclusions years earlier, and the prison had become the final setting of his life. His death therefore closed the legal story in a way few people had expected when the death sentence was imposed in 1986. But the end of Ryan's life was not the end of the meaning of the Rouleau case. The most enduring questions remained with the living. How had a small religious community become so isolated? How had Ryan acquired such authority? Why did other members accept his claims that he could speak for Yahweh? How could violence become normalized inside the group? And most importantly, how could a 5-year-old child and a 26-year-old man become victims within a community that had originally presented itself as a religious refuge? The answers are not contained in a single event. They are found in the gradual construction of power. Ryan's authority developed over time. His beliefs became rules. His rules became obligations. His obligations became punishments. And eventually, those punishments became lethal. That progression is what makes the Rouleau case so disturbing. The final tragedy was not simply that Michael W. Ryan killed. It was that he had created an environment in which other people could be persuaded to accept, assist, or remain silent while terrible acts were committed. His death from brain cancer in 2015 ended the life of the man at the center of that system. But it did not erase the evidence of what the system had done. The graves near the farm, the testimony of former members, the court records, and the convictions remained. For Luke Stice and James Thim, there was never another chapter. Their stories ended in 1985. For Michael W. Ryan, the story continued through a trial, a death sentence, decades of appeals, and years on death row. He ultimately died without being executed. The punishment announced in 1986 was never physically carried out, but the judgment against him remained until the end of his life. And in the final accounting of the Rouleau murders, the most important fact is not how Ryan died. It is why he was imprisoned in the first place, because two people, one of them a 5-year-old child, lost their lives inside a community where one man's religious authority had become powerful enough to turn belief into control and control into violence. The death of Michael W. Ryan in 2015 brought the final personal chapter of the Rouleau case to an end, but it did not erase the history that had been uncovered on the farm in Richardson County, Nebraska. By then, almost 30 years had passed since investigators discovered the graves of Luke Stice and James Thim. Ryan had spent nearly all of those years under a sentence of death, repeatedly challenging his conviction and sentence through the courts. Yet the most enduring significance of the case was not the length of Ryan's imprisonment, nor the fact that he ultimately died from terminal brain cancer rather than by execution. The deeper significance lay in the structure of the community he had created and in the way religious authority, isolation, obedience, and violence became connected. The Rouleau murders are remembered because they demonstrate how a small group can become dangerous when one individual is permitted to define not only what is believed, but also what is permitted, forbidden, rewarded, and punished. Michael W. Ryan had presented himself as a man capable of receiving direct instructions from Yahweh. That claim became the foundation of his authority. The so-called arm test gave that authority a practical mechanism. A question could be asked, an arm could be tested, and the resulting movement could be interpreted as a divine answer. What mattered was not whether the method had any objective ability to reveal divine commands. What mattered was that members of the community accepted the interpretation. Once they did, Ryan's personal wishes could be transformed into something far more powerful, an order presented as the will of God. The consequences became increasingly severe. The community was influenced by Christian identity, posse comitatus, anti-government ideas, and expectations of an approaching Armageddon. Weapons and ammunition were accumulated. Members became involved in thefts of property, livestock, machinery, and other goods. Those activities were connected to the group's preparation for the future Ryan and his followers believed was coming. The community became increasingly separated from the ordinary structures of society. That isolation mattered because the people inside the group were increasingly dependent on the rules and authority that existed there. When a person lives within a closed environment where the leader defines truth, outside institutions can begin to appear not merely unnecessary but hostile. In Ryan's world, the outside government and other perceived enemies could be treated as threats to the community's survival. Inside that environment, obedience acquired a religious dimension. A member who disagreed with Ryan was not simply disagreeing with another person. According to the system Ryan had created, disagreement could be interpreted as resistance to Yahweh. That distinction helps explain how ordinary acts of control could become increasingly severe. The group developed a hierarchy in which some people possessed greater status while others were treated as inferior, including as slaves. Rick Stice and his young son Luke were among those who suffered within that system. Luke was only 5 years old. He depended completely on adults for protection, food, medical care, and safety. Instead, he became the victim of violence. On March 25, 1985, Ryan struck Luke, causing the child's head to hit a hard object. Luke became unconscious. Rather than receiving emergency medical treatment, he was taken to a bed and people prayed for him. He died. His death was concealed, and his body was buried on the property. The significance of Luke's death goes beyond the crime itself. It shows the terrible consequences of a system in which authority had become more important than the basic responsibility to protect a child. The same community would soon produce another tragedy. James Thim, 26 years old, was also placed in a position of submission within Ryan's hierarchy. He became the target of prolonged abuse. According to the court record, Ryan and 4 other people tortured Thim for approximately 3 days. The violence included severe physical abuse, humiliation, and sexual abuse. On April 29, 1985, Thim died. His body was also buried on the property. The difference between the 2 deaths should not obscure their connection. Luke and Thim were different ages and occupied different positions within the community, but both became victims of a system in which Ryan possessed extraordinary power over the people around him. The discovery of their graves transformed the investigation. What had initially involved criminal activity surrounding stolen property and the group's extremists activities became a homicide investigation. Other members were prosecuted. Dennis Ryan, Michael Ryan's son, was among those involved in the events surrounding Thim. Other members, including Timothy Haverkamp, James Haverkamp, and John David Andreas, also became part of the legal proceedings. Some cooperated with prosecutors and testified. Their testimony helped establish what had happened inside the community and helped distinguish Ryan's central role from the actions of the other participants. That cooperation also revealed another important feature of the case. Ryan's influence extended beyond his own physical actions. The violence was carried out within a group, and members could be drawn into behavior they might not have committed independently. That does not remove their individual responsibility, but it demonstrates the importance of understanding the environment in which the crimes occurred. The prosecution of Ryan eventually centered on James Thim's death. In 1986, Ryan was tried for first-degree murder. The defense raised questions concerning his mental condition and presented an insanity defense. The prosecution countered with expert testimony and argued that Ryan remained criminally responsible for his actions. The jury rejected the insanity defense and found him guilty. He received the death penalty. Later that year, Ryan entered a plea of no contest to second-degree murder in connection with Luke Stice's death. He was therefore legally held responsible for both deaths. The convictions established the central conclusion of the criminal justice system. Ryan was responsible for the murders, despite his claims concerning religious authority and his arguments about his mental state. But the courts continued to examine his case for many years. His appeals included challenges involving competency, judicial conduct, and later the method of execution. The Nebraska Supreme Court upheld his conviction, and the United States Supreme Court declined to review the case in 1990. Later post-conviction proceedings also failed to overturn the judgment. The long legal process is significant because it demonstrates that the case was not resolved simply by condemning Ryan. His constitutional and procedural claims were repeatedly examined. The courts had to determine whether errors had occurred and whether those errors were serious enough to require a new trial or a different sentence. They repeatedly concluded that Ryan had not established such grounds. The result was a death sentence that remained in place for almost 30 years. Yet the state never carried it out. Ryan eventually died in prison in 2015. His death ended the possibility of execution, but it did not change the convictions. The legal record remained: first-degree murder for James Thim, second-degree murder for Luke Stice, and a death sentence that had never been executed. For the victims' families, however, legal conclusions could never provide what had been lost. No verdict could restore Luke's childhood. No sentence could return James to the people who knew him. And no amount of time could change the fact that both deaths occurred inside a community that had been controlled by one man's interpretation of religious authority. This is perhaps the most important lesson of the Rouleau case. It is tempting to describe such a story simply by calling the central figure a cult leader and leaving the explanation there. But that description does not fully capture the process by which power was created. Ryan did not begin with complete control. He built it through beliefs, relationships, rules, hierarchy, isolation, and repeated assertions of authority. The arm test gave his decisions a sacred appearance. Extremist ideology provided an explanation for the dangers he claimed were approaching. The community's separation from the outside world reduced opportunities for independent judgment. Punishment discouraged resistance. Over time, these elements reinforced one another. The result was a system in which violence could be justified as obedience. That is why the Rouleau murders remain important beyond the identities of the people involved. They show that dangerous communities do not necessarily begin with obvious signs of murder. They can begin with promises of certainty, belonging, protection, and religious purpose. The danger emerges when those promises become inseparable from unquestioned authority. In the Rouleau community, the consequences were catastrophic. A 5-year-old child died. A 26-year-old man died after prolonged abuse. Other members became participants in crimes and later witnesses against the leader. And an isolated Nebraska farm became the setting for a case that would remain in the American criminal justice system for decades. Michael W. Ryan eventually died behind prison walls. But his death was not the conclusion that defines the story. The defining conclusion belongs to Luke Stice and James Thim. Their lives ended because a system of control had been allowed to become stronger than the ordinary. Boundaries that should protect human beings from violence. The graves found near Rouleau revealed what that system had concealed. The testimony revealed how it operated. The court proceedings established responsibility. And the decades of appeals demonstrated how the law responded to the extraordinary crimes committed within it. In the end, the Rouleau case is not only a story about an extremist leader or 2 murders. It is a warning about what can happen when authority is treated as sacred. Dissent is treated as betrayal, and the suffering of vulnerable people is hidden behind the language of faith. Luke and James cannot speak for themselves anymore. Their voices survive only through the record left by investigators, witnesses, courts, and those who knew them. That record is enough to establish the essential truth. They were victims of a system that Michael W. Ryan created and controlled. And although Ryan died in 2015 without ever facing execution, the judgment against him remained. His life ended in prison. The lives of Luke Stice and James Thim had ended decades earlier. That difference is the final and most painful measure of the Rouleau murders for Ryan. There were decades of appeals, legal arguments, and time. For his victims, there was only the moment when that time was taken away. The story of the Rouleau murders does not end with the discovery of two graves. The conviction of Michael W. Ryan, or his death in prison in 2015. Those events provide the chronology of the case, but they do not fully explain why the Rouleau community became the setting for such extraordinary violence. To understand the lasting significance of the case, it is necessary to return to the structure Ryan created and to the people who were caught inside it. At its center was a man who claimed to possess a direct connection to Yahweh. Around him was a small religious community influenced by Christian identity, posse comitatus, anti-government ideas, and expectations of an approaching Armageddon. The group accumulated weapons and ammunition and became involved in thefts across Nebraska, Missouri, and Kansas. But the most serious danger was not directed outward. It eventually turned inward. Ryan's authority gave him the ability to define who was faithful, who was disobedient, who deserved punishment, and what punishment could supposedly be justified. The arm test became one of the mechanisms through which this authority was exercised. A physical movement of the arm could be interpreted as a divine answer. In itself, the procedure was simple. Its importance came from the meaning Ryan and his followers assigned to it. Once the result was accepted as the will of Yahweh, a personal decision could be transformed into a religious command. That distinction became crucial when members of the community were punished. If Ryan had simply ordered someone to suffer, another member might have questioned him. But if the punishment was presented as God's command, resistance could be portrayed as disobedience to something far greater than the leader himself. This created a dangerous circular system. Ryan claimed divine authority. The group accepted that authority. Their acceptance strengthened Ryan's position. His strengthened position allowed him to impose more demands. Those demands reinforced the belief that obedience was necessary. Over time, the boundary between religious belief and Ryan's personal authority became increasingly difficult to separate. The consequences were devastating for the most vulnerable people within the group. Luke Stice was 5 years old. He was not an adult who had chosen to join an extremist movement or accepted its ideology. He was a child dependent upon the adults around him. Yet on March 25, 1985, Ryan struck him, causing Luke's head to hit a hard object. The child became unconscious. The decision that followed was critical. Luke was not taken to a hospital. Instead, people prayed for him. He died, and his body was later buried on the property. Ryan eventually entered a no-contest plea to second-degree murder for Luke's death. The legal resolution confirmed his responsibility, but the facts themselves remain the most difficult part of the story. A child had suffered a serious injury inside a closed community, and the response was not emergency medical treatment or an immediate call for outside assistance. The community's internal beliefs and authority structure took precedence. A little more than a month later, another member of the group died. James Thim was 26 years old. Unlike Luke, he was an adult member of the community, but his position inside Ryan's hierarchy had deteriorated. He became the target of prolonged punishment and abuse. According to the court record, Ryan and 4 other people tortured Thim over approximately 3 days. The violence included severe physical abuse, humiliation, and sexual abuse. On April 29, 1985, Thim died. His body was also buried on the property. The fact that more than one person participated in the abuse of Thim is essential to understanding what happened. The crime was not simply the isolated act of one individual losing control. Other members became involved. Among them was Dennis Ryan, Michael Ryan's teenage son. Other people connected to the community were later prosecuted as well. Timothy Haverkamp, James Haverkamp, and John David Andreas became part of the legal proceedings. Some members eventually cooperated with prosecutors and testified. Their testimony helped expose the events that had occurred inside the community and provided the legal system with information from people who had been within Ryan's circle. Their involvement also raised difficult questions about individual responsibility. People can be influenced by a powerful leader, but influence does not automatically eliminate responsibility. The courts therefore had to consider the conduct of each person separately while also understanding the larger system in which the crimes occurred. For investigators, the challenge was to reconstruct events that had taken place inside an isolated community and had been concealed from the outside world. The investigation did not begin with a complete understanding of what had happened. Authorities had become interested in the group in connection with other criminal activity, including stolen agricultural equipment. John David Andreas and James Haverkamp were arrested on June 25, 1985, in connection with such property. As investigators examined the community more closely, the picture changed. The farm was not simply the home of an isolated religious group. It contained evidence of weapons, ammunition, stolen property, and other indications of the community's activities. Searches in August 1985 eventually led investigators to the graves of Luke Stice and James Thim. The discovery transformed the case. What had appeared to be an investigation involving extremist beliefs and property crimes had become a double homicide investigation. The graves provided physical evidence that the community had concealed the deaths. The testimony of former or cooperating members helped explain how the victims had died and what role Ryan and others had played. The prosecution that followed focused on James Thim's death. Ryan was charged with first-degree murder. During the trial, his mental state became a major issue. His defense relied on an insanity argument, while the prosecution presented expert testimony challenging that claim. The central legal question was not simply whether Ryan held unusual or extreme religious beliefs. It was whether his mental condition made him legally incapable of being held responsible for his conduct. The jury rejected the defense and found him guilty of first-degree murder. Ryan was sentenced to death. Later, on July 28, 1986, he entered a no-contest plea to second-degree murder in Luke Stice's death. The legal system had therefore established responsibility for both deaths. But Ryan's case did not end with sentencing. His appeals continued for decades. He challenged aspects of his conviction and sentence, including questions involving his mental competency and the conduct of the sentencing process. One important issue concerned Judge Robert T. Finn and meetings involving relatives of the victims, outside the presence of Ryan and his attorneys. The Nebraska Supreme Court acknowledged the existence of such a meeting, but concluded that Ryan had not demonstrated sufficient prejudice to overturn his judgment. Later federal proceedings also failed to provide the relief Ryan sought. Other challenges concerned Nebraska's method of execution and the drugs that would be used in lethal injection. These legal disputes contributed to the continuing delay. Ryan remained on death row while the case moved through the courts. The sentence that had been imposed in 1986 remained in place, but its execution remained unresolved. In 2001, Ryan was moved to Tecumseh State Correctional Institution as Nebraska transferred its death row prisoners. He continued to live under a sentence of death. Nearly 30 years had passed since the murders when his health finally changed the course of the case. Ryan developed terminal brain cancer. On May 24, 2015, he died at Tecumseh State Correctional Institution at the age of 66. He was never executed. The state of Nebraska had sentenced him to death, but the sentence was never carried out. His death from illness brought the legal struggle to an end without an execution. Yet the absence of an execution should not be confused with the absence of a judgment. Ryan remained convicted of the murders for which he had been sentenced. His death did not erase those convictions. It simply meant that the state never performed the final punishment. For the families of Luke Stice and James Thim, the ending was therefore different from what the original death sentence had suggested. There was no execution to mark the conclusion. Instead, the man convicted in connection with their deaths died decades later inside a prison. But the most important legacy of the case is not the fate of Michael Ryan. It is the record of what happened to the victims. Luke was 5 years old. James was 26. Both were members of a community that Ryan controlled. and both died after becoming vulnerable within that system. Their deaths demonstrate the danger that can emerge when a leader's authority becomes absolute and when a closed community begins treating the leader's decisions as sacred commands. The Rouleau case also illustrates why the concept of cult violence cannot be reduced to the presence of strange beliefs. Religious or political beliefs, even extreme ones, do not automatically produce murder. The critical issue is what happens when belief becomes a mechanism for controlling other human beings. In Ryan's community, belief was linked to hierarchy, punishment, isolation, and obedience. His claimed connection to Yahweh provided a justification for decisions that otherwise might have been challenged. Once that structure was established, increasingly serious acts could be normalized. The progression is disturbing precisely because it was gradual. The community did not begin with the deaths of Luke and James. It developed through relationships, ideology, authority, rules, and increasingly severe control. By the time investigators uncovered the graves, the system had already caused irreversible harm. The Rouleau murders, therefore, remain a warning about the importance of independent judgment and the protection of vulnerable people inside closed communities. They also demonstrate the limits of legal punishment. Courts can determine guilt. They can impose sentences. Appeals can review errors. Prison can remove a dangerous person from society. But none of these mechanisms can restore a life that has already been taken. For Luke Stice, there would be no adulthood, no future, and no opportunity to tell his own story. For James Thim, there would be no recovery from the abuse that ended his life. Their stories survive through the evidence and testimony preserved in the legal record. Michael W. Ryan eventually died, but the system he created remains the more important subject of the case. His death closed one man's life. It did not close the questions raised by Rouleau. How does a person acquire such authority over others? Why do members remain obedient when the behavior around them becomes increasingly abusive? How does a community become isolated enough that terrible events can remain hidden? And how can religious language be transformed from a source of belief into a tool of domination? There are no simple answers, but the Rouleau case provides a clear sequence of consequences. Ryan claimed authority. The group accepted it. The authority became control. Control became punishment. Punishment became violence. Violence ultimately resulted in death. That sequence is the enduring lesson. The most frightening part of the story is not that one man possessed extreme beliefs. It is that those beliefs became powerful enough within a closed community to affect the lives and deaths of other people. In the end, the farm near Rouleau is remembered not because it was large or famous, but because of what happened there. 2 people died. A child and an adult became victims. Several other members became involved in the crimes and later in the prosecution. A man was convicted and sentenced to death. Nearly 3 decades later, he died naturally in prison before that sentence could be carried out. The legal case ended, but the meaning of those events remains. The final measure of the Rouleau murders is not the length of Michael Ryan's imprisonment, nor the number of appeals filed, nor the years he spent waiting for execution. It is the lives of the people who never received those years. Luke Stice should have grown beyond 5. James Thim should have lived beyond 26. Instead, their lives ended inside a community where one man's authority had become stronger than the ordinary safeguards that protect human beings from violence. That is why the story of Rouleau continues to matter. It is not ultimately a story about a mysterious farm or an unusual religious group. It is a story about power, obedience, vulnerability, and the consequences that follow when no one within a closed system is able or willing to challenge the person at its center.